here's the plan. So the correct way to do this would be to pull the engine, which is actually drop the engine because the engine has to go at the bottom of this car. But I'm not going to do that. I don't really have the space or equipment to do that. So I'm going to rebuild it in the car. It's a little bit difficult, but I think it's doable. One of the big problems though is that I have to take the transmission off to get at all the clutch and flywheel stuff, and also to replace the crankshaft, which is the whole point of this project. But most of the engine mounts supporting the engine are on the transmission. So what you could do is put something under the oil pan, like a big piece of wood, and jack it up. But I can't do that because I have to take the oil pan off too to get at the crankshaft. So my plan now is that first I'm going to start taking out everything I can here, clear up as much of the space as possible, and then I'm going to put something like a piece of wood or a bar of metal across the strut towers, secure them down, and hook a chain to that engine mount, that engine hoisting mount. So then I can just support the engine with a chain up here. If you have an engine hoist, you can just use the engine hoist. I don't, so I'm just going to use what I have. And it's okay if it sags a little bit as long as it stays basically in this place. I'm going to take the transmission off, take the oil pan off, replace the crank, clutch, flywheel, all that, do all the transmission stuff, then put the transmission back on and re-secure all the engine mounts, and then I'll start doing the top end stuff. So I can still have the oil pan off while I'm doing the top end, so I can connect all the rods to the crank, but since the transmission is supporting it, I won't need anything in the way anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and start ripping all the stuff out I can here. If you're working on one of these cars, these trim pieces either side of the engine bay are actually removable. Just 3 screws here, here, and here. Not a whole lot more space, but it does give you a little bit better access. And you do need to remove them to work on the strut bolts. So there's a little tip for you. Got the exhaust off, all the fluids drained, and now I'm getting the axles off and the clutch and the shifter. So, but I've encountered a problem here. I thought I could just move the axle out of the way, but this one's way too short, doesn't have enough play, so I have to remove it. And I don't have the right size socket for this. It's 30 mil. Tried a 32 and just started stripping it. So I have to go to the store and buy a socket. Okay, I got a socket. It was surprisingly hard to find this. They were sold out of almost all 30 mils except this one. I wanted a deeper one because I'm kind of worried this might not be deep enough. And it still might not be. It does go on, but just barely. So hopefully I can get this off. If not, I may just replace the axle and just cut this. It worked. Sorry for not showing more of what I'm doing, but this is really frustrating and time consuming. I'm just trying to get it done. But anyway, I've got almost everything disconnected from the transmission except for some brackets and the mounts. Before I continue, I've got the car back on the ground. I'm going to take this tube, cut it up into a brace that goes across the engine bay here to hook to the engine, and then we can start disconnecting the transmission. Okay, so I'm putting the transmission out. That was deeply unpleasant. So right now, the engine's being supported by this bar. I put a jack under this to get it out. So to get it out, this is what I had to disconnect. Both drive shafts. So the driver's side one I had to remove completely. The passenger side one I could disconnect and just kind of move out of the way. I had to disconnect the shift linkage, which was bolted on top of here. The clutch, which was bolted on top of here. So this is where the shift linkage was, this is where the clutch was. And also there's a pin here you have to remove for the shift linkage. Removed all the engine mounts, so there's that one, and that one. So it's the back of the car, front of the car, driver's side. I actually had to remove the front one completely from the car because it was preventing me from pulling the transmission back, so I couldn't get it off of the engine. And then the bolts, there's on the front side, so towards the front of the car, there's 17 mil here at the bottom, 14 mil above that, another 14 mil above that. On the top, there's a 17 and a 17. And then on the front, on the engine side, there's a 14. This took me forever to figure out because everything online that I've read said that there was 4 bolts to remove. There's 5. So this one comes from the other side. And then once those are all out, you're just kind of like wiggling it back and forth and keeping a jack under it, and I was able to get this out eventually. So now, before it goes back in the car, I'm going to clean this up. There's lots of oil on it. These engine mounts are pretty rusty, but the rubber is actually in good shape, so I'm going to reuse them. I'm just going to clean these up. And I'm also going to clean up the engine bay as much as I can. But the transmission had to come off because the clutch plate and flywheel have to come off in order for me to remove the crank. So that's what I'm going to start doing now. So while removing the crank pulley, the bolt was completely stripped out from our previous owner. I couldn't get a socket on it at all. So I tried grinding the bolt head off, but with the limited space I had, I couldn't actually get enough of the bolt head off to remove the pulley. And I tried cutting it as thin as I could, but trying to remove the pulley just broke it a little bit more. I initially tried to cut through the pulley, but I kept breaking grinding discs. So eventually what I did was just cut through these spokes and remove this pulley part. Then I get my grinder and cut this top off here, which let me remove it finally. Now the reason why I was okay with doing this is you don't want to do this if you don't have a replacement pulley. I do have a replacement pulley though. You might note they're not exactly the same. This is from the Corolla, this is from the MR2. But the only major difference is that the accessory belt areas here aren't the same size, but on mine I was only using the inner one anyway. You can see wear on here and no wear on here. I was only using the inner one anyway because the other one's for an air conditioning unit. I don't have an air conditioning unit, so this will be perfectly fine. I'll clean up some of the rust, but this was going back on the car. Okay, so I've got the crank out of the car. So this is a 4A GE crank. This is a 4A FE crank. This was in the car. This is a donor from a Corolla. As you can see, they're almost identical, which is why I'm using the 4A FE one instead of sourcing an actual 4A GE one. But there are some differences. The most important for what we're doing here is that the bolt pattern for the flywheel is different. The 4A FE has a 6-bolt pattern. The 4A GE has an 8-bolt pattern, which means you need a new flywheel. I'm going to replace the clutch and flywheel anyway, so I just ordered one for the Corolla, and it should fit just fine with the transmission because everything else is the same about it, just the bolt pattern is different. Also, the oiling holes. I've noticed that on the 4A GE, each of the rod journals has 2 oil holes, one on each side, and the 4A FE has only 1 oil hole for the rod journals. So for performance applications, that's going to be a thing, but I don't think it's going to be an issue just because we're just turning this back into a daily driver. As well, if you read online, the 4A FE crank is supposedly cast and the 4A GE is forged. Now, looking at the two of these, they both have tool marks on them which lead me to believe that they're both forged. But this is from a very late model 4A FE. This is from 1996 Corolla. So if you've got one from the 80s, it might actually be cast. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure this one's forged, so it's not a big deal. The reason why you care is because a forged one is going to be a lot stronger than a cast one. So for high horsepower applications, you definitely want a forged one. In my case, I don't really care all that much. I hope this one is forged, but again, I'm not chasing power. I'm just building it back to be a daily driver. So I don't care all that much. Other than that, these are basically identical. The other thing to worry about is that there are some differences in rod sizing between years. I won't have that issue because I just am using the rods out of this engine, so these are the rods that were on this crank, so there won't be any size problems. Also ordered new pistons that'll match those, so whatever comes out of the car doesn't matter. I'm putting new pistons in anyway, so it'll all match up perfectly. So you can see the damage it caused me to have to replace this crank. So if you see my little video on replacing bearings with the crank in place, this is what I was trying to fix because I had oil starved this engine, which is what caused this damage. And for most of them, that replacement would have actually worked. Most of the races are just fine. But this one is chewed up real bad, and this one a little bit too, on the rod ends. So these are probably out of round and are just going to chew up any new bearings I put in there. As well, I think that the rod in this one is probably also out of round. So I have to replace that rod anyway, which is, I have to tear down the engine to do that. So I could have this machined, but that's fairly expensive, and I have to get new different size bearings for this. I want to keep this as close to factory as possible, so I got this for 50 bucks, way cheaper than I could get this machined or a new 4AGE crank. And because everything is undamaged, I can just use factory specifications, which simplifies my life a lot. One thing I'm doing while I have this all apart is the transmission mounts are still good. The rubber in them is just fine, but they're very rusty. So since I have this apart anyway, I'm going to clean these up and paint them so they're not so rusty. Okay, so I'm ready to put the crank in. Now the way you're supposed to put these in is take the whole engine out, flip it upside down, and install it that way. But I don't have a way to do that. So what I've done is I've got new bearings installed in the engine there. And I'm going to use a jack, a piece of wood, to lift up the crank into place. I'll put the end caps on the ends to hold it up to take the jack away. And I'll put the rest of the end caps on and slowly tighten it up. It's not ideal, but it's the only way I can think of to do it without pulling the engine out of the car. Now, all these bearing races are lubricated by the engine oil, but you don't want it dry when on its first startup. And normally you'd put what's called assembly lube on the bearings, but I can't find any of that locally. You could use motor oil, but it's pretty thin, because assembly lube needs to lubricate everything on first start, stay in place while you're installing it, and most importantly, get out of the way once real engine oil starts flowing. So I'm using gear oil for this, which is not ideal. So the gear oil will be good enough to keep it from being dry on the first start. The more oil will flush it out, and then I'll do a couple early oil changes to flush out all the gear oil, and that should be good. Okay, I've got the new crank mostly installed. It was actually easier than I expected. I did hit one little snag though. The thrust bearings, it's these little guys. These limit the front and back motion of the crankshaft. Anyway, I ordered a bearing kit that was for the 4AGE, which makes sense because this is that block. But I think this crank has just a little bit different size here than the 4AGE crank, because these thrust bearings are just a little bit too big. I can get one on one side if I push the crank all the way one way, but then I can't get it on the air side. It's way, way, way too big. So I'm going to supported by 5 of these caps. I'm going to throw the last cap in temporarily just to hold it in place while I wait for new bearings to arrive in the mail. I'll order ones for the 4AFE crank, but for now it's in place and I can go and start doing the other things like put the transmission back on, put the oil pump back on, those kind of things. Okay, now the crank is in. I redid the rear main seal. I did have a leak back here. It actually wasn't the rear main seal itself, although I did replace that. It was the cover here. The gasket around it was probably 40 years old and cracked and leaking. So I just replaced it with some RTV because I don't have a new seal. But that should work for now and solve that leak, which is a nice silver lining to tearing this engine apart. As well, on the front of the engine I have a new oil pump. But I pinched the front main seal when putting it back in, so I'm going to have to get another one to replace it. But again, same deal back here. It was leaking around the oil pump, got some RTV in there, so that's sealed and should be good to go now. Now I could have gotten away without replacing the oil pump, but I decided to anyway, just because the fact that if any metal shavings got into the pump, then the pump's probably got some damage and is not going to hold pressure, or maybe even like stop pumping at all at some point, so just safer to go with a whole new pump. Torque spec for the flywheel bolts is 58 foot-pounds. Gonna need both hands for this. Okay, so new clutch is in. The bolts for the clutch cover are only like 12 foot-pounds, so they're not a huge deal. Now, for the second hardest job in an MR2, get the transmission back in the car. The first hardest is getting the transmission out. So, yeah. Okay, so I got the transmission back in the car, which was an absolutely miserable experience to do with jacks and jack stands. I had to put two jacks underneath it and kind of seesaw it back and forth because it's unevenly balanced, and it was just a nightmare. I didn't film it, unfortunately, because it took me 2 days of lots of swearing and cursing, and it just was very frustrating, so I didn't want to film it. But this is one of those jobs where if you can afford to have a shop do your clutch or whatever, or have access to someone who has a lift, I'd highly recommend that. It'll make it a lot easier. But yeah, it can be done on jacks. It's just kind of a nightmare. Now, because the engine is supported by the transmission, while the transmission is out, I supported it with this bar here, which I showed earlier. Now, it was flexing more than I liked, which is why I zip tied the second bar on top. Now, the zip ties aren't holding any weight. They're just to make sure that this doesn't move so that it can actually support the other bar. And now, as I'm getting the mounts back in for the transmission, I can take this out. But there's one other thing. My garage tried to kill me because the really crappy concrete in here failed like that. So, almost dropping the car. Thankfully, I wasn't under it at the time. This garage has really terrible concrete. I really should have put one of these underneath it, like a wood on soft earth, but I didn't think of that. So I will be doing that in the future. Right now, the car is actually being supported by a jack back there, and I've got the tires back on. So I'm going to take it off these jack stands and put it back on its tires for the night. But yeah, don't take risks with stuff like that. So now that the transmission's in, I'm bleeding the clutch, which is also fairly annoying. And the Aw11, the clutch reservoir is right next to the brake master cylinder in the front. The bleeder is up behind the transmission, so it's a little bit of a pain to get to, but one thing that makes this job a lot easier is to get one of these vacuum pump brake bleeders. It just makes this job a lot easier and actually possible to do by yourself. If you don't use one of these, then it's kind of impossible to do this job by yourself. You need someone to help you. But I'm by myself, so I'm just going to use this bleeder. Okay, so now I'm taking the heads off because I need to take the heads off to get the pistons out. And this is quite involved. Right now I've got the valve covers off, and I have to remove the cams themselves to get at the bolts for the head. Now, one thing to note about these is that each of these caps is numbered, and you can't get them out of order. If you get them out of order, it can cause problems. So, thankfully, Toyota puts numbers on the caps. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's pretty easy to get them in the right order, but just make sure you don't mix up the sides. Another thing is I was kind of worried about the oil starvation causing damage to the cams too, and it looked like it did a little bit. I see a little tiny bit of scoring on these, but not very much at all. And it was not making any top end noises, it was only making bottom end noises, so I think this will be fine. Okay, so what I've done now is I've removed the fuel rail so I can get at the bolts for the air intake side here. I can take that off, and then I'll take the exhaust manifold off, and then I should be able to remove the head. Now with the injectors, I've labeled them 1 through 4 so that when I go to put this back together I don't get them in the wrong spots. It should be difficult to get them in the wrong spots because of where the wires are in the harness, but just in case so I don't confuse myself, I've labeled them. As you can see, everything is filthy. It's because this engine's had oil leaks for years and years and years, and plus it just lost all its oil on the highway. So one nice thing is that by taking this apart, I can clean all this up and have the engine be nice and clean. This is not just good for aesthetics, it also helps it run a little bit cooler. I am trying to avoid removing anything I don't need to remove, just to make my life a little bit easier when things go back together. Okay, so the head is out. I did get a lot of crap in there while I was pulling it out, so I'm going to have to clean that up pretty good first before putting it back in. But now with the head out, I can get those pistons out, get the rods and pistons changed, and then before I put it all back together, I'm going to do some cleanup in here just to make it a little bit nicer. As well, there's a few things like this sensor here. It was just taped off, it wasn't connected to anything, I have no idea what it's for. The car was running fine without it. And there's a bunch of little things all over this car because this car's been modified a lot. So I'm going to go around and remove anything that wasn't being used just to simplify putting it all back together. Back under the car, it's very tight down here, but I need to push the pistons out from the bottom. Now I'm not too worried about damaging the pistons since I'm not reusing them, but I do need to worry about damaging the crank, which is in there now. Now, I should have done this with the crank out, but given that I had to put the transmission back on to support the engine, that's why I did it this way. So I've just got this long extension bar. I'm just going to go carefully push up and push up on the pistons. Okay, so I'm cleaning up some of these engine parts here and thought I'd share a little bit of Toyota trivia with you. On these early 4AGE engines and some of the other Toyota engines, you'll notice this TVIS logo on the intake manifold. So this is on the blue top or big port 4AGE engines. And what this is variable intake system. So between the intake and the head is this little guy here. So you see on these have huge intake ports for each cylinder. That's what makes these the big port heads. And what these are is each of these, one open, one with a valve, is for each cylinder. So there's 4 pairs here. At low RPM, these valves are closed and restrict the flow just to the one open port. And then at higher RPM, these open up, I think about 4,500, and give you more airflow. And so it acts like it has different size ports on the head. Now, Toyota did abandon the system pretty quickly because it wasn't great, but it did have some effect. If you have this and yours is not working properly, like it's sticking or something, you can bypass it by disconnecting this air line and blocking it off, and it'll lock these open permanently. But if yours is working normally, you should leave it alone because it did actually have some effect. So you won't gain any horsepower by bypassing it, and you might actually lose a little bit. But if it's giving you problems, just block this. Including the engine bay, you can see that's before and that's after. So I go around the whole engine bay and do that. A lot of pipes and tubes were all rusted, so I've sanded them, coated them in epoxy, and painted them so they won't leak. I made my valve covers pretty, and I'm cleaning some carbon out of the heads. This is before, this is after. Now you might wonder why I don't just replace the valves, and I can just do that, but this head was running really good, so I don't want to mess with it as much as I can. So I'm just going to clean it up and put it back in, instead of messing with anything like valve clearances and stuff like that. Oh, and one tip when you need to disconnect tons of little hoses and stuff, as you take them off, give them labels. That way you can tell where they go when you have to put it back together. You don't have to trace them all the way back to the source. Okay, so pistons and rods. So this is the piston and these are the rods from the 4A FE engine I got the crank out of. I want to use the rods out of there just so that I made sure they match the crank. There are some different journal sizes between different years. So I know these will match the crank because they came from the same engine. These are the pistons from that engine, which I cannot use because the 4A GE and 4A FE have a little bit different pistons. The 4A FE is a little bit dished across the whole surface, whereas the 4A GE is flat for more of it. So initially, I looked for a late model 4A FE, knowing that they have 20mm wrist pins, and the early models have 18mm wrist pins. And I thought that all the 4A GEs had 20mm wrist pins. But also, for some of the early ones, they had 18mm wrist pins. So I was planning to reuse my original pistons, but they're 18mm and my rods are 20, so I can't use them. And it turns out getting new pistons is cheaper than getting new rods, so I got these. It took me a bit to find them. They weren't hard to find, but most sellers couldn't tell me if they were 18 or 20mm. They, for some reason, just wouldn't go measure their stock. This seller did confirm it, so I got them. These are also a floating pin style, so this is a press pin style, which means that you need a press at a shop to remove these and put them in. Whereas these are floating pins, so the pin will go in the rod and it's actually held in by these little clips. So I'll probably have to heat the rods up a little bit to get the pins in, but not nearly as hard as putting press pin style in. So you can see I pressed these ones out, and you can see I damaged the piston by putting it in the vise to press these out. So I was okay with that because I knew I wasn't going to be reusing these, but I didn't really know how I was going to do it with these ones because I was going to reuse them. But since now I'm using these, I don't have to worry about that as much. So now I'm just going to put all the rings into the pistons, assemble them with the rods, and put them in the car. Oh, as well, pistons have to go in a specific way. So on these ones, there's a little nub on one side of the piston. This goes towards the front of the engine. And with the rods, I don't know if you can see that, but the rods have little tabs in here where the bearings seat. So these will go to the left side of the engine, which in the MR2 is the front of the car. So if the engine is facing this way, and the car is facing this way, and the piston is facing this way, and the rod with those little tabs is facing this way, So they'll go together like that. Okay, so I've got all the pistons and rods joined up, and I'm just starting to put the bearings in the rods, which means I'm almost ready to put them in the engine. Now you see I've got the engine covered in tape right here. That's just because while I had the heads off, I didn't want anything falling into all the coolant channels and stuff like that, so I covered it up. Now I'm just going to take this off, give it a quick clean, and start putting the pistons in. So I'm using this piston ring compressor, and it's been taking me a bit because I've been fiddling with it because I really want to make sure all the rings are captured by this, because it's pretty easy for a ring to slip underneath and not be compressed by this. So what I do is set this in here, let this center itself, make sure it's lined up properly. Then I'm just tapping the top of the piston until it goes into the block. So the pistons themselves are aluminum, so you don't want to use anything metal for risk of damaging it. So I'm just using the wooden handle of this hammer. I'm just tapping the top with another hammer. And there we go. So now it's in, and now I can go to the bottom and hook it up to the crankshaft. Now that the pistons are in, time for a brand new head gasket. Okay, so I'm getting ready to put the head bolts back in. You can reuse them sometimes, but they're cheap, so it's generally not a great idea. And in some engines you can't reuse them at all. So I do have new head bolts here, but the new ones didn't come with washers, so I've actually recovered the washers from the old head bolts. Now you'll notice there's two different lengths of head bolt here. And so it's important to keep track of what goes where when it comes off. If not, you can always Google it and find diagrams. The long ones go on the exhaust side, and the short ones all go on the intake side. And so right now I'm going to clean them. Even though they're brand new, I am going to clean them and make sure there's no contaminants in the threads. And same with the washers. And then put a little bit of oil on each of the threads and each of the washers. Just that way you get a correct torque reading when you go and torque everything down. Okay, so on the internet, everyone has conflicting ideas of how to torque these bolts, and everyone argues about it. The one thing everyone agrees on is the order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The way I'm going to do it is I've snugged them all down. Then I'm going to go one round of 22 foot-pounds, and then one round of 90 degrees, and a final round of 90 degrees, and that's how I'm going to torque them down. If that's not how you do it, then I guess be mad at me, but that's how I'm doing it on this one. The torque specs for the 4AGE changed over the years, so I suspect that the early specs probably were not super accurate and they updated it for later. So this is more what they were talking about later, is the 90 degrees and 90 degrees. So I'm trying to get the shield back on, but it won't quite go into place. It just almost doesn't get there. And looking where it's touching, you can see down there where it just touches the head. So I think I was supposed to put the shield on before I put the head back on, but I'm not taking the head back off. That's not happening. The engine mount right here is also kind of keeping it, like the engine mount slopes towards the block there. And if you can just go a little bit further back, it'll fit. So I could take the engine mount off, but that's a pain too. The engine mount's got 3 different attachment points. So it's attached to the block right there, it's attached to the body under there, and then it splits in the middle right there. Now I will have to split it in the middle to put the new timing belt on, but getting it off the block is what I have to do to get the shield to fit, and that is a really tight space, so I'm not doing that either. Now all this shield is for to protect the timing belt, keep dust and dirt and stuff out of there, and the part that's touching is right up against the block. So I'm actually just going to chop that off, get this to fit, and then maybe I'll wedge a piece of aluminum tape in there or something just to keep the dust out. Not super worried about it, because if it's right up against the block, there won't be much dust getting back there anyway. It fits now. So one of the modifications I've made is I drilled a little tiny hole in the top of that oil drain bolt and added a peg to the oil pan, And I've got a wire connecting them so that the oil drain can't come out as long as that wire's on there. Is this overkill? Yeah. Almost every single car on the road just gets by having the oil drain torqued down properly. But I'm paranoid, and if this ever happens again, it'll break me. So I'm going to do that to make sure it can't happen again. Okay, so after I got the engine back together and timed everything, it wouldn't start. I narrowed the problem down to spark, and then after poking around the distributor system, I found this little guy. So this was all wrapped up in electrical tape. So clearly this is broken before, and someone just did a twist and tape wiring job to repair it. I never messed with it before because it was working. It's honestly kind of impressive this didn't break before now. So I'm going to strip these wires and fix this properly. Actually, I'm going to make these wires just a little bit longer, just because where it was, this is kind of difficult to plug in, and maybe why it broke to begin with. Looks like I'm out of red 16 gauge, so I'm going to do them both in white. On this short of a distance, won't matter because it'll be pretty obvious what goes where. Okay, all soldered up. I also threw it in some gutter tube just to give some extra protection. I'm not sure if that was the problem, but it certainly didn't help, so we're going to find out now if the car runs. So, she's dead. I got everything back together, ran it around the block, and immediately started knocking again. Drain the oil. I don't know how much you can see of that there, but that's bearing material. Which means either the crank or rods weren't good, or more likely, because they looked good, the block isn't good anymore. Or I screwed something up and didn't torque it down correctly or something. But either way, she shredded her bearings again, which means that we're back to the same problem, and I can't justify any more time or money into this, so that's it. So to add insult to injury, I just sold the MR2, and I was out here working on the 4Runner to distract myself, and this happened. Yeah, I'm having a bad week, guys.